Good day, subscribers, and welcome everybody back to The Contrarian. Today I will be talking about Janet Yellen and the more likely threat that she is actually not talking about. And essentially this has to do in part with what Janet Yellen has said multiple times recently. Essentially she's been warning of the United States government effectively defaulting on some of its national debt and just how catastrophic that would be to the US economy and to the global economy, essentially. And that is true. It would be very catastrophic. It would be a extremely unexpected event. Bottom line, it would be an extremely bad thing for the United States to do. However, I don't think that this is actually likely. I think that it's more likely that something else happens that wouldn't be as unexpected, but it would effectively cause the same amount of economic damage, and that is inflation, and much higher inflation than what the Federal Reserve is talking about being their target. They've effectively wanted 2% annual inflation rate to be their sort of target inflation rate. Right now it's going much hotter than that. In other areas where CPI is not calculated, it is effectively much higher than the 4% CPI or whatever is being reported. Housing, food, and energy would all be in this much higher category. But essentially, the bottom line for the Fed to need to have inflation run much higher than what they're saying, it essentially has to do with where we are right now with the debt to GDP ratio of the United States. And effectively where we are right now is roughly 140% a debt to GDP ratio. And looking back in past time, in an economy, essentially whenever you exceed 130%, usually you either go one of two pathways. Effectively, you almost always go one of two paths, and that is either a defaulting on debt or massive inflation that effectively inflates away the debt. And inflation is the debasement of the underlying currency. And so the reason why inflation actually benefits the debt to GDP ratio is that when you inflate away the value of the dollar, you're effectively expanding the GDP ratio. Even if the economy isn't growing at all, the GDP is still going up simply because the value of the dollar is going down. And also concurrently, the debt is becoming less valuable. So effectively, if say the United States were to go through a period kind of like the 1970s where the debt was somewhat inflated away, you could theoretically get the debt to GDP ratio down simply by cutting government expenditure and letting inflation run much hotter than normal. And the benefit of this is that it would be very hard to point blame around. It is much more comfortable for the Federal Reserve, for the central banks, to go the route of inflation than to go the route of debt defaults. And debt defaults are much more sudden. It's much more easy to point blame. It would be very easy to point blame at, say, Jerome Powell or Janet Yellen, who are both in the central banking system right now. Whereas inflation, they might not even be around at these positions when the effects of the inflation finally begin to be seen by the majority of people out there. So inflation is actually the more likely pathway that I personally see this going. You can either go debt defaulting or you can go inflating away the value of the currency. And I do believe that this is the much more likely pathway simply because this is historically what is the most comfortable thing for governments to do. It can be very easily done. For example, it is very easy to get the majority of people oftentimes behind programs which cause significantly more inflation than what would be desirable. For example, all of the stimulus that we've seen since the lockdowns and everything in the last year and a half, all of this has contributed to more inflation gradually building. And inflation, another benefit of it is that it comes with a lag. For example, it takes a lot more time for the velocity of the money that has been injected into the system. It takes time for the velocity of the money to actually begin increasing. And so it also takes time for the effects of the inflation of this monetary supply increase. It actually takes a significant more amount of time for that to come into full effect than defaulting on the debt, which would be almost very immediate. It would cause very immediate effects, and it would essentially be able to cause a much more uncomfortable situation for the central banking system. So all of this being said, I do expect inflating away the debt to be the path that all of these central banks around the world, in fact, attempt to go. The one sort of roadblock with the United States trying to do this is the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency, which could mean that they would have to do a significantly more amount of stimulus or money printing or whatever you want to call it. They might have to actually do significantly more amounts of that than other currencies around the world, simply because they are not the world's reserve currency. So it could be possible to see in the coming years, if the Fed is in fact not getting this inflation that they actually really want, it's entirely possible that we could just continue to see direct payments to consumers or more stimulus or whatever until they get that kind of desired inflation. And another benefit of this for the top, 1% of the 1% is that inflation really does benefit those who own the most assets. It's really those who own the assets who benefit from extremely high levels of inflation, while for those who don't own assets, it just makes it much more difficult to purchase a house or to invest in the stock market or whatever. So all of this being said, I'm not trying to provide some sort of solution to this. I just don't see a much more different of a path for the Federal Reserve at this point, except for them to try to inflate away the debt. We'll just have to see how this turns out, but that is kind of the likely path I see right now. In terms of what Janet Yellen is warning about, she's somewhat correct in that defaulting on the debt could be sort of an unexpected event that has to happen at some point, defaulting on some of the debt anyway, but I guess I personally see a much more likely pathway in terms of the Federal Reserve trying to inflate away the value of the dollar and therefore just inflating away the value of the debt itself. So all of this being said, let me know what you guys think about this down in the comments below, and I hope to see you again at some point.